Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
So I'm Kristin Neff, and I'm an associate professor at UT Austin in the Human Development and Culture program. And I got interested in self-compassion when I was finishing up my PhD at Berkeley. And got interested for personal reasons. I started a Buddhist meditation practice, and it had an immediate, profound impact on my life. And then I did a postdoctoral research a couple years with a self-esteem researcher and started getting more familiar with all the research showing that self-esteem is quite problematic. You know, leads to narcissism, social comparison, etc. So when I got the job at UT Austin, I decided I wanted to study self-compassion and to see if it could offer the same benefits of self-esteem without the drawbacks. And that's kind of led me to where I am today.
Well, so you're kind of working on exploring the topic of self-compassion. Is that your most important value, or what is the most important value to you personally?
Well, I think compassion in general, you know, and some people have asked, well, why did you start with self-compassion? Why not just compassion in general? And I guess the answer for two things. A, I really wanted to offer an alternative to self-esteem. I've always been interested in self-concept. So I was interested in how compassion applied to the self might lead to really different outcomes than, you know, needing to feel special and above average. And also other people were doing work on compassion for others and empathy for others, but not really self-compassion. But yeah, I would say compassion is a huge value of mine. Now I even like to use the term open-heartedness, because compassion tends to be specific to the context of suffering. And of course we want to have open hearts in the face of suffering, but we also want to have open hearts in the face of joy and, you know, when we're at our best, when we have great successes or achievements. So really just keeping our hearts open no matter what happens, positive, negative, or even neutral. So that would be my value, I would say.
So open-heartedness.
Yeah. Open-heartedness, open mind, open heart, just trying to stay open.
And how did that value become important to you? Like if you look to the narrative of your life, how did open-heartedness become important?
Well, so if you, the whole narrative, I was raised by a very open-minded mother. My father wasn't around much, but he was, you know, hippie dropout movement. So I was never raised in traditional religion. And so I grew up with a lot of ideas of awakening, and that the purpose of life is to awaken spiritually. But then I went through a period, which I think I needed to, of going straight for the intellect, going to graduate school, questioning how much of this was BS, how much of this was wishful thinking, how much of this was true. So I think I went through maybe a 7-year very shut down period where I just threw everything out, including the baby with the bathwater. You know, I'm just not going to believe in anything because, you know, I went to like my mom used to listen to the tapes, like this woman who channeled a 35,000-year-old being, things like that. So there was a lot of, you know, it was a kind of a mixed bag. But then she also, you know, studied a self-realization fellowship at Paramisi Yogananda, who's a very authentic teacher. So it was really mixed bag. So I rejected it all, I think, closed down. And then it ended up getting me in a very unhappy place. I made bad relationship choices. I was cutting off my lifeblood by shutting myself down, and I didn't even realize it. So once I did finally come to realize it, that I'd basically become dead by shutting down my heart in an effort to see if the mind could take me the whole way. It actually couldn't. So then the last year of my PhD, when I started studying started studying Buddhism, open mind, open heart, and then self-compassion, I realized I wanted to join the two. You don't have to choose heart versus mind. That there is a path that, you know, can use the mind in the service of the heart. So that's kind of how, you know, it got me here. And then certainly in my personal life, it's been huge. I don't know if this is a good time to talk about Rowan, but yeah, so my son was diagnosed with autism in 2004, and I'd already had about 7 years of pretty solid Buddhist meditation, self-compassion practice by then. And it definitely was, first of all, hugely helpful to me in dealing with his autism, just in the stress of the moment when he would tantrum, being able to be mindful, stay centered, to give myself compassion for how incredibly stressful and scary and difficult it was in the moment. So on a moment-to-moment basis, it got me through. But that kind of open heart, open mind approach to things, we also, my husband and I both, used towards his autism. So instead of, just wanting to cure him or fix him or really fighting against the autism, we tried to go with the autism. Where is he leading us? What is he trying to show us? We wanted him to heal in the sense of not to suffer so much from the tantrums and the dysfunctions of autism, but we didn't want to cure him. We just wanted to help him in a way that would kind of allow his beautiful potential to shine as opposed to making him normal. And so that led us on an incredible journey, including going to Mongolia. He had a really strong and positive reaction both to horses and to shamans. My husband does a lot of human rights work with the Bushmen in southern Africa. And so my husband, who's very crazy, said, where in the world combines healing with horses? Mongolia. So we went to Mongolia and rode from shaman to shaman on horseback. And he wrote a book about it. We made a film about it. And it really is that when you approach something that's difficult like autism with this open heart and just allowing to see the gifts as well as acknowledging and comforting yourself with the real pain and distress of it, it has this real transformational quality. And our son, who you just met, is doing great. He's still autistic, but he's just a charming, fun, but really intelligent boy. Our lives have transformed. We go on one of these healing journeys every summer. We went to Namibia and then Australia, and we're going to Brazil this summer. So I'm really convinced that this open heart, open mind approach and letting life emerge as opposed to trying to control it and making it be a certain way, leads to a lot of happiness.
So it sounds like you had kind of closed yourself off, kind of getting intellectualizing things.
Absolutely,
and then you went to a Buddhist center and started doing mindfulness.
Mindfulness meditation.
Was there any kind of events that happened there where you kind of gained some insight about, oh, this is pretty good, I really should do this? Was there like some kind of instance or a story of something that happened?
Well, I write about in my book, maybe the thing that drove me to start meditating is I had a very messy divorce breakup with my first husband. I go into it, I actually ended up having an affair, which is something that I always considered myself such a moral person, and I was just horrified by. But I realized later that because I was so shut down, it was the only way I could break out of that shutdownness, because I didn't have enough consciousness at the time to see how unhappy I was. So that happened, and then it's this idea that I could have compassion for what happened. So instead of just tearing myself to shreds, I'm so horrible, how could I have done that? Having compassion, it doesn't mean saying, oh, it's fine, no big deal, but actually quite the opposite, allowed me to take it much more seriously and see what actually did happen and what effects have I had. And what does this mean about my life and how I'm living my life and what changes I need to make so that I don't, have that type of thing happen again. So it was really just immediately useful for me to, understand, forgive, and more than that, nurture myself so I could get to where I needed to be, which is really fully integrating spirituality and the intellect in my life. So, yeah.
So in the meditation center or the Buddhist center, there wasn't like any certain event that was like, it really kind of tapped you into the importance of...
Well, just talking about it, I started sitting with a group. It was actually a Thich Nhat Hanh group who studies his approach. And they just talked a lot about self-compassion, and I hadn't really heard of it before. I'd thought about compassion for others, but not compassion for yourself. And it was like a light bulb went off over my head. Like, oh, wow, I'm allowed to be kind to myself as well. This is also something I should encourage. And I started seeing how beneficial that would be, and practicing it and seeing how beneficial it was for me. And then, going on my first meditation retreats and just actually consciously encouraging open-heartedness towards myself and seeing how that impacted things. So
it seemed like a gradual
thing, yeah. It wasn't like a sudden Well, it was kind of subtle. Like I say, the first time I read Sharon Salzberg's book, Loving Kindness, and it was like, whoa, it just really changed my life reading that book. So, yeah.
Well, another thing I like to look at is metaphors. So a metaphor, do you have a metaphor? I guess open-heartedness is almost like a metaphor in itself.
It is, yeah.
So for self-compassion, do you have a metaphor what self-compassion is like?
Other than open-heartedness?
Yeah, I
don't think that works, yeah.
I guess that's kind of like creativity, just,
another metaphor, and this is a metaphor, but it's also, there's some truth to it, is if you think of a loving mother caring for her crying child. And in fact, what happens, we're finding out the research, is that when you give yourself compassion, or even compassionate touch, but really, or say very kind, compassionate words, you tap into the mammalian caregiving system, that same physiological system that allowed you to be soothed by your mother as a baby, and also which prompts the parent to soothe the child. Why does the parent want to soothe and comfort the child? Why is the child soothed and comforted? It's because as mammals we have this whole system that releases oxytocin and opiates, makes us feel calm and safe, reduces our cortisol levels, stress, which is associated with fear and threat. So, when we're compassionate to ourselves, it is not only metaphorically, but in some ways physiologically, as if we're rocking ourselves, mother comforting a crying baby. And in fact, we do reduce our cortisol levels and up our oxytocin levels. So we are tapping into that system.
Mm-hmm. So what would be your metaphor for compassion then? Sounds like they're almost the same.
Yeah, I mean, I see, for me, open-heartedness is the core state, and then it manifests differently. So open-heartedness towards your suffering is compassion. Open-heartedness for my suffering is self-compassion. Open-heartedness towards your joy and accomplishments. There's a term in Buddhism called mudita. It's also called sympathetic joy. So I can feel with you in your happiness as well as feel with you in your sorrow. It's not just negative states. I call this towards the self. I haven't done research on it yet, but I wrote a chapter on it, self-appreciation. So when you can honor and acknowledge your strengths, what's beautiful about yourself, not because I'm, better than other people, but just because I'm a human being and part of the human experience is also beautiful as well as, sorrowful. That's also so in other words, open-heartedness is the same receptive, open, intellectually open and emotionally responsive mindset, and then when it encounters different objects, it has a different flavor. The idea is if nothing's coming up and you're just open, then that's equanimity. That's just that, sometimes on meditation retreat, no strong emotions are coming up, positive or negative, and there's just this quiet, empty peacefulness. So, from my perspective, it's all the same state. It's just what's arising in awareness and how it manifests. Yeah.
So, I've mentioned to you that kind of my interest is really empathy.
Yeah.
And for me, empathy is like a first step, like a prerequisite for compassion.
Yeah.
And then compassion is kind of like empathy applied to pain or suffering. I was just wondering, how do you see that self-compassion, self-empathy, empathy and compassion, like how does that kind of all fit together?
Well, how are you defining empathy? It all depends on the term's defined 5 different ways.
Yeah, it's it's basic part about mirror neurons.
Right,
As I'm watching you now, I'm kind of watching what's happening, and that's kind of being modeled, felt inside of myself. And
so emotional perspective taking, basically, is another way of putting it. That I emotionally resonate with what you're feeling.
Or it's the actual feeling of...
Right. You're right. So how do I know what you're feeling? Because I'm feeling it inside of me, so we're resonating. And my mirror neurons are firing as you're giving off certain emotional signals.
So for example, all the movements you're doing, they're kind of
yes, you're feeling it.
And so I'm feeling the energy that you're kind of, the emotional state that's coming out of that.
So I would say that although that's hugely important I would also differentiate. So Nancy Eisenberg has a nice model where she differentiates empathy, sympathy. Well, she just goes empathy, sympathy. I would add compassion as the third layer. So empathy is knowing what the other person is feeling, right? Being very tuned into what you're feeling it in my body. That doesn't necessarily mean you care. So con men have great empathy skills. I can subtly feel, oh, I see he's a bit nervous right now. Oh, I see he's a bit distracted, right? So I can use that emotional awareness of what you're feeling to take advantage of you. So in and of itself, it doesn't necessarily mean you care. So sympathy is, I'm aware of what you're feeling and I care about it. Like, I feel moved by your suffering, I feel concerned, I want to help you in some way. I would add compassion is very, very similar to sympathy, but for me, what makes compassion a bit different is it includes this common humanity interconnectedness component, right? So I might see that you're suffering, have sympathy for you, but what makes that different than pity? For me, the difference between, sympathy could be pity, it could not. How do you know if sympathy is pity or something different? If that sense of common humanity is there but for the grace of God go I. We're all in this human, interactive, interdependent, dynamic situation together. That's what makes it compassion for me, from my perspective. So they're all related. I would say, however, though, because my son is autistic, and empathy in terms of that emotional perspective taking is difficult. Kids with autism have fewer mirror neurons, although there is variation. My son's actually fairly emotionally perceptive, very interested in emotional expressions, and he loves making me have an angry face or a sad face or a happy face. So, Simon Baron-Cohen's data is not fully replicated. This isn't a truism yet, it's a theory, so we'll see if it pans out. But even if it is true, I know a lot of autistic children who, if you say, I'm really upset by what you said, or you start crying, or you have obvious displays of emotion, then they're right there. They care. They'll come comfort you, cuddle you, bring you a toy, something. So they can't perspective take in the sense that they can't figure out that, if let's say you were not showing an emotion, you were totally hiding it, they aren't going to be able to say, I bet she's upset. You'd have to say, I'm upset. But as long as you display the emotion, then that sympathetic response could come up. So, empathy is not the same thing as sympathy or compassion. I'm not even sure it's completely necessary. I think it really helps. But if I couldn't read you, I know a lot of people with Asperger's. They have a really hard time reading others' emotions, really hard time. They say it's like being on a different planet, like going to India and not knowing how to speak the language. But if you say clearly, this is what I'm feeling, they still care as much as anyone else. So they're related, but not exactly the same.
Yeah, so I'm a little unclear about that. It's like you're, in terms of if I'm wanting to care about you and I can't have that empathic connection, how can I go to the next step and have compassion for you? It seems like in that sense, it's like the first step.
Well, it's basically how do I get the information? Right? Yeah. How do I get the information that you're suffering? So empathy might be because my mirror neurons can sense that you're suffering. I'm feeling it within my own body, or maybe I'm imagining, well, God, in that situation, I would suffer, so this person must be suffering. Some people may not have access to those sources of information because their brains are wired differently. So, but if you tell me explicitly in a medium in which I can get that information, I am really hurt right now, I'm really sad right now, I'm really upset, then there's no reason the heart can't still respond, right? So caring about yourself, like I said, you can also be very empathically in tune and not give a damn because you're a con man. You're like, oh great, he's feeling afraid, I'm going to take his money right now. So the two are separate somewhat, from my point of view. And I think it is important in something like autism. You don't want to assume that because someone has a hard time with empathy, that they therefore can't feel sympathy.
Do you have a metaphor for empathy? What would empathy be like if it was an animal or land, type of land, or just anything?
A mirror, yeah. Mirror neurons, I guess, not original metaphor, but yeah.
Yeah, for me, empathy is like a cornucopia, in the sense that by being able to have that mirroring process, I get to experience all these kind of experiences of another person.
Yeah.
And I get to experience it for me. So have you heard of the term self-empathy? Is that
I have. hasn't really had any much research done on it. I know sometimes the term's thrown out there. So when I was trying to define self-compassion, I was looking, well, what's out there already? And I forget, a few people have written about it, but not in an academic context. Again, from what I've read, but I'm sure there's stuff I haven't read that I should read, they're using the word empathy to mean sympathy, that I care about, that I have understanding for myself, that I care about what I'm going through, that I'm kind to myself, etc. I don't think you could actually talk about self-empathy in terms of, am I aware of my own emotional process, which would be maybe mindfulness. Mindfulness might look a lot like self-empathy.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways these terms are kind of looked at.
That's the problem with this whole area, is that people can be talking at cross purposes. They mean the same thing, but they're using different terms. So.
And even in academic circles,
completely.
It's still, so that's one reason I'm trying to get a sense of clarity about this.
And it's useful too, because there's a lot of people, like when I talked to Simon Baron Cohen and I said, well listen, maybe they can't emotionally mind read, but if you say I'm sad, they're going to care. He's like, oh yeah, I guess, that's true. He just had never thought of it. It's kind of interesting. He's a leader in this field. So.
Okay. Let's see, there's, you were just given a presentation on self-compassion as a sort of source of motivation.
Source of motivation.
Would you like to talk about that?
So a lot of people really believe that their self-criticism is necessary to motivate themselves, and that if they were not hard on themselves, they would let themselves get away with anything. So that fear of self-punishment, okay, I better go up to the gym and exercise, otherwise I'm going to call myself all these vicious names, and I don't want to do that, so I'm going to go get to that gym. They think that that's effective. And I argue, and the research actually definitely backs this up, that self-criticism is not an effective motivator because it makes us depressed. The link between self-criticism and depression are very, very tight. And if you're depressed, it's very hard to be motivated, almost by definition. It makes us lose self-confidence. And again, researchers who look at motivation and they figure out, well, why is this person successful and not this person? They both have the same ability level. The key seems to be how self-confident they are. If you believe in yourself, you're going to be more likely to achieve your goals than if you don't. And if you criticize yourself, you undermine your own self-confidence, right? People who are self-critics develop fear of failure. It's like, that conditioning. Every single time I fail, I beat myself up with self-criticism. I'm going to condition myself to fear failure, I don't even want to risk it. So self-critics often engage in what's called self-handicapping strategies. So for instance, maybe they'll procrastinate. I'm not going to study until the last minute, so therefore if I mess up, I can blame it on not studying and not because I'm stupid. Or they might, just take the easy A and not really learn anything. And also the thing about self-criticism, if you're very self-critical, it's very hard to see yourself clearly, to acknowledge your weaknesses, because it's too painful to do so. And in fact, you're more likely, if you can get away with it, to blame someone else for your problems, because that feels much better. I don't have to criticize myself, I can criticize you, that feels much more pleasant, right? So self-compassion does motivate you, but for different reasons. You're motivated by self-compassion because you care about yourself and you want to alleviate suffering. So compassion is concern with suffering and the desire to alleviate suffering. So if you're engaged in behaviors that are unhealthy, smoking cigarettes, skipping work, doing something that's really unhealthy for you, if you really truly have self-compassion, you aren't going to want to continue with those behaviors because they're causing you suffering and you care about yourself. So a parent, for instance, doesn't let their child eat whatever they want, eat all the donuts and ice cream they want, skip school. The parent says, you got to eat your vegetables, you got to do your homework, you got to get to bed on time, because if you don't, you aren't going to be healthy and happy, and I care about you. So the same thing with ourselves. We put boundaries on ourselves. We do say, we can't do this or we need to do that, but because we care. And so research now is coming out showing that either people who have higher levels of self-compassion, or if you teach them to be more self-compassionate, they engage in healthier behaviors, like it helps them give up smoking. It encourages people to exercise, but for intrinsic reasons, not because I'm unacceptable as I am, but because I want to be healthy, which is a much more sustainable way to do things like that. It encourages people to stick to their diets if they have a weight loss goal. Oftentimes what happens when people blow their diets, they beat themselves up, then they eat to make themselves feel better. So they end up eating more after they started the diet than they would have otherwise. So if you teach people to be self-compassionate about blowing their diet, they can actually stick to their goals. Health-related behaviors like seeing the doctor, practicing safe sex. More and more research is coming out all the time showing that self-compassionate people are motivated, but they're motivated out of care, not out of fear of self-criticism or self-judgment.
I've been to a conference where they were talking about happiness and that connection with people is a source of happiness, and that self-compassion is kind of related to that. That we're wanting to connect with others, and that's where the deepest source of happiness comes from.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's why so part of self-compassion, at least the way I define it, is this connectedness component, this feeling of common humanity. We are all in this together, right? We're all human beings experiencing it and also influencing each other. So, the problem with self-esteem or even narcissism is you may feel good about yourself, but you also may feel, if you have to feel superior to others, you're happy in a sense that I'm number one, but there's also a way in which you're undermining your own happiness because you feel isolated and separate from other people. So with self-compassion, when you confront, say, a failure, you really blew it, instead of feeling isolated and judging yourself, if you remember, this is the shared human condition. Everyone blows it sometimes. We all make mistakes. As a matter of fact, that's what it means to be human, to be imperfect. Then you can actually derive a sense of contentment, of happiness, through the care and sense of connectedness you give yourself in an instance of failure, which is so beautiful. Sometimes you talk about metaphors. I like to use the metaphor of semi-sweet chocolate, right? So if it's just happiness and, la la la, everything's perfect, that's like milk chocolate. I don't really like milk chocolate, it's too sweet. If it's just sorrow and suffering, that's bitter chocolate, really not very pleasant. But what makes a Nestle's Toll House cookie so good? It's sweet and bitter. So that mix, it's both. It's holding both the light and the shadow simultaneously. So when you have self-compassion, you're honoring the suffering. You aren't ignoring it, repressing it, trying to fix it. You're saying, this sucks, basically. This really hurts. But then you embrace it with this sense of, poor darling, this is hard, this caring concern, this feeling that everyone experiences this. This is part of something we all go through. You're layering connectedness and caring concern on top of the suffering. And what you end up with is something very, very rich, like, semi-sweet chocolate. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so psychologically healthy. It's seeing things as they are, but bring in a new component to your experience, which is connectedness and care. I say bring in a new component. Someone else might say uncovering the care and connectedness that was already there. It could be either.
So it sounds like there's a consoling. It's like a self.
Yes, self-soothing. Self-soothing. Paul Gilbert talks a lot about this self-soothing. And the reason that's important, there's a lot of work with mindfulness, and mindfulness is wonderful, and you let go of judgment, and you allow your experience to be as it is. But mindfulness applies to what's coming up in your conscious awareness, what thoughts and emotions, what experiences, and may I accept it as it is without trying to change it or judge it, just let it be. And that's incredibly powerful and helpful for well-being for all sorts of reasons. But self-compassion is not about what's coming up in awareness. It's about the person experiencing whatever's happening. So it's not about, so you might have, I'm experiencing, intense feelings of hurt. Okay, I can hold that in mindfulness. But self-compassion says, I'm sorry you're hurting. It's aimed at the person who's having the emotional experience. So I won't get too complicated, but self-compassion requires a self, right? The idea is you don't really suffer if you don't have that strong sense of ego and sense of self. So it's almost like a relative emotion. If you didn't have a sense of self, if you were enlightened, you wouldn't need self-compassion because you wouldn't be suffering, right? So, so self-compassion is actively soothing and comforting yourself because you're suffering. And again, you're releasing oxytocin and opiates. You can feel it in your body if you start practicing it, just putting your hands over your heart. It's like this warmth, this calm feeling, this safe feeling. Your cortisol's dropping, your oxytocin's going up, and it's like, I'm safe. And safety is the best platform to make any decision. You know, whenever you want to do anything important in your life, if you feel safe, you'll do a better job at it.
Well, that kind of reminds me, something that was coming up for me is my father. He came from Germany after World War II, so he went through a lot of difficulty, refugee, parents killed, and so forth, so a lot of alienation. And then he found religion, found Jesus. And it seems to me that that's very similar to the self-compassion part, in the sense that you have a friend. You know, it's like an empathy buddy or a compassion. So I'm wondering, what is the relationship with that?
You know, I've definitely thought of that as well. I mean, I haven't looked closely at it, and I had people talk about, well, what about self-compassion in other religious traditions other than Buddhism? And I want people to look at that, because I really think, why do people? There's so many different types of Christianity. You know, it's not all one piece. But one of the most powerful aspects of it, it seems to be, is when people accept Jesus Christ as a personal savior, you know, always there, comforting, soothing, guiding me. And I think that maybe that's either a metaphor or reality, depending on your religious belief, but regardless, it's this incredible source of soothing, comfort, and compassion all the time. You know, from my perspective, whether I call it myself or I call it, you know, the Mother Mary or something, it almost doesn't matter if it's psychologically, it's giving you what you need, which is feeling compassion and care for yourself. You know, unfortunately, with Christianity, some people really emphasize the compassion, love, and acceptance, and some people emphasize the you're going to hell bit. I think the you're going to hell bit is much more strongly linked to self-criticism. But yeah, I would love someone to do a study of like self-compassion in Catholicism, or you know, different parts of Christianity, or mystics, you know, mystic Christianity, and it'd be really interesting.
So how do you see your work going forward now from this point?
Well, gosh, you know, there's as much research to do with self-compassion as there was with self-esteem. Tens of thousands of articles. So I really think you can look at self-compassion and almost anything. Where I am personally, I'm really happy a lot of other people are doing self-compassion research now and looking at how it relates to, I don't know, creativity or health behaviors or dealing with aging or this and this and that. So I'm really interested now in teaching self-compassion. So I've developed a program, an 8-week program to teach self-compassion called Mindful Self-Compassion in conjunction with Chris Germer, who's a very close colleague. Also teaching like week-long intensive workshops. I'll probably start teaching weekend workshops. So I feel like I've convinced myself, and hopefully enough other people, this is a good thing. Now I want to get on to how to help people have it. You know, those people who are on board, how do they learn to be more self-compassionate? And that's, you know, largely the motivation for writing the book. It's not only to explain the concepts, but I have exercises and meditations so that you can actually practice this, start learning this as a new skill. So I'll continue to do research, but I suspect my role will be more researching the intervention as opposed to just in general what's self-compassion linked to. So I'm really excited about that.
So as you know, my kind of focus is on how do we build a culture of empathy and compassion. And how do you feel that that kind of fits in with the work that you're doing?
Well, one thing, and I talked about that a little bit in my presentation today, is, you know, there's been this big movement, self-esteem movement in the schools, and it's basically backfired, and we've got the most narcissistic generation of college students ever recorded. So the emphasis on you're great, you're special, you're a king for a day has led to what some people call an epidemic of narcissism. And of course, narcissism is not really what we want for a compassionate, empathetic culture. So I think teaching self-compassion to kids in the schools would be one way in. And there are a few people starting to do this. Certainly mindfulness they're teaching to kids in the schools. If they layer in a lot of explicit discussion of self-compassion, and I think it should be explicit, because as kids, you know, even by 10 years old, girls are like judging how thin they are or how fashionable they are and all this. Letting kids know the problems with needing to feel superior, special, above average. Teaching kids there's another way. You know, if you're being bullied or picked on, you know, let's try to develop compassion for yourself, compassion for other people. If we start young, I think that might really help develop a culture of compassion. I'm sure there's things you could do with older populations too. So for instance, they're having great work with prisoners, kind of a captive population, but you know, teaching mindfulness to prisoners, what would happen if you taught them self-compassion? Several people are starting to look at teaching self-compassion to vets with PTSD coming back from the wars. You know, so wherever there's suffering in our society, and there's a lot, I think if we teach people how to have self-compassion, and then of course, I start with self-compassion because it's actually more closely related to your immediate sense of mental health and well-being. But of course, open-heartedness is not just towards me, it's towards everyone. So I think once you open your heart and you feel safe enough to be with yourself, then that really facilitates, you know, the larger compassionate message. Let's be compassionate to everyone. It's all about shared humanity. You know, I kind of go, sometimes I get very hopeful, and then sometimes I think, well, we'll get it together and then the planet will be 100 degrees higher in temperature. And we'll see. It's almost like a race. We're either going to become awake and compassionate, or probably going to die, if at least humans, not other species.
So it's like, it's a whole thing of addressing this question of, is true deep empathy, you know, would you really manipulate and hurt somebody? If,
again, it all depends how you define it. If you're only defining it as kind of more cognitive perspective taking as applied to emotions, it's different. But if you're talking about really feeling for, caring for, resonating like I'm connected, that more connection, I think they are quite different. I think we just need a lot more clarity about all these terms. And I think that it's not just a matter of we need to agree in our definitions. I think because we're so confused about what we're talking about, all these arguments get so muddled. You know, I think I think they had one a while ago. We need a new conference for people to sit down and what do I actually mean? You know, what's actually going on with these empathy circuits? Are we just talking about something cognitive? Are we talking about emotional responsiveness? And really, you know, figure it all out. But I'd be really interested in learning about these programs and, you know, talking about, well, can you add a self-compassion component too? Because I do think if you just focus on empathy for others and you don't deal with the very real pressures in our society for self-esteem, to be number one, to be look a certain way, to feel better, special and above average, that it's not going to be as powerful and sustainable unless people have a way of feeling good about themselves that doesn't require feeling superior than. So, you know, maybe if you put me in touch, let's talk about collaborations.
Yeah, we can get a conference going.
You know,
kind of work
I would love
these
that.
Kind of, because I think it's important to get the different communities together to have like a shared vision so we can work, you know, together to really transform society to support these values.
And the people doing nonviolent communication work, they do brilliant work completely in line with all this. And it's kind of there's not as much, and partly that's because they aren't as involved in academia and academic research. But, you know, in terms of boots on the ground, they're doing amazing work in the schools with marriage counseling and all sorts of ways of helping people have compassionate communication. So I agree, it'd be wonderful to have a forum for us all just to talk to each other so we aren't reinventing the wheel all the time, you know. Yeah, absolutely.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.